Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. The Muslim theologian Ibn Taymiyya on God, creation, and time. John Hoover, University of Nottingham. God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and his throne was on the water. Quran, chapter 11, verse 7. The Islamic tradition, along with the Jewish and Christian traditions, confesses one eternal God who originates a world characterized by time. Like their Jewish and Christian counterparts, Muslim theologians face the question of how this eternal God interacts and intersects with the temporality of the world, which leads them into debate over whether the world is eternal or had a beginning, as well as a reflection on the nature of God's eternity. After briefly surveying classical and medieval Islamic approaches to the question of God, creation, and time, I, Dr. John Hoover, will give primary attention to the Damascene theologian Ibn Taymiyyah, who died on 1328 AD, who takes the unusual step of bridging God's eternity and the world's temporality by locating time in the essence of God. This study is an exercise in the history of theology and philosophy that seeks to explore how ideas developed and how they fit together. The Kalam theologians. The three major streams of Kalam theology formulated and nurtured the dominant Muslim understanding of God's relation to the world and time. The Mu'tazili stream extended from the 8th century to the 13th century before dying out as a moment in its own right. Twelver and Zaydi Shi'is adopt many Mu'tazili doctrines and have continued the tradition into the present. The Ashari Kalam theologians take their name from Abul Hasan al-Ashari, who died in 1935 AD, who broke away from the Mu'tazilis to defend divine predestination and other doctrines. The Maturidi Kalam theologians derive from the Central Asian theologian al-Maturidi, died 944 AD. Ashari and Maturidi theologies dominated Sunni Islam through the early 20th century and remain vibrant to the present day. Mu'tazili, Ashari, and Maturidi theologians differ over key issues such as human freedom and the origin of evil. However, they share a common foundation in the Kalam cosmological proof for the existence of God. This proof is now reasonably well known among Christian philosophers of religion thanks to the work of William Lane Craig, and it contains within it fundamental Kalam assumptions about God, creation, and time. I, Dr. John Hoover, will outline the basics of the proof as developed in Ashari theological handbooks like the Iqtisad by the famous Al-Ghazali, who died 1111 AD. The proof may be set out in the form of categorical syllogisms. Major premise: everything temporally originated, hadith, has a cause. Minor premise: the world is temporally originated. Conclusion: the world has a cause, which is God. The Arabic term hadith, which I translate temporally originated, carries the sense of existing after not having existed. For most Kalam theologians, the major premise of the above proof is necessarily knowledge. That is, it is undeniable that everything that originates and comes into existence has a cause. This applies to both the seen and the unseen. All things seen within the world require a cause to come into existence. The need of originating events for causes applies to the unseen by analogy. No one saw the beginning of the world as a whole, but if the world in fact originated, it too required a cause to bring it into existence. Most medieval Muslim theologians and philosophers do not cast the principle of causality into serious doubt. They may disagree over the causes of specific things and events, but they agree that everything that originates requires a cause, whether that cause be God or an intermediary. The minor premise of the Kalam cosmological argument states that the world as a whole was temporally originated. Kalam theologians proving this using the following disjunction: the world must be either temporally originated or eternal. The world is not timelessly eternal. Therefore, the world must be temporally originated. Kalam theologians deploy two main methods to prove that the world is not eternal. One method argues that an eternal world would lead to an infinite regress of events in the world. Following in the train of the 6th century Christian theologian John Philoponus, who died 570, and the Muslim philosopher Al Kindi, who died in 870. The Kalam theologians argue that an infinite regress is impossible. They assert that it is not possible to traverse an infinite number of past events, nor is it possible to add more events to an infinite number of past events, because an infinite by definition cannot be increased. Likewise, one infinite cannot be a multiple of another, as would be the case for different planets revolving eternally at different speeds. All this being impossible, past events and time cannot be infinite, and the world must therefore have had a beginning. The second way of arguing for the temporal origination of the world is from the origination of accidents. This was the approach of especially the early Kalam theologians. In the atomistic cosmology of early Kalam, the entire world is made up of atoms and accidents. Accidents like color and motion inhere in atoms and temporarily originate. Atoms combine in turn to form bodies. It is then asserted that any atom or body in which accidents subsist must itself be temporarily originated. Therefore, the world as a whole, which is a body, is temporarily originated as well. Looking back at the Kalam cosmological proof for the existence of God, once it has been proved that the world is temporarily originated, it then follows that the world has a cause. Moreover, this cause or originator of the world must be timelessly eternal, always existing without a cause, because, as many theologians further explained, an infinite series of causes is impossible. The cause of the world is, of course, God. The Kalam proof for the existence of God is criticized by philosophers in the Aristotelian tradition. The Aristotelian Neoplatonist Avicenna, which is known Ibn Sina in Arabic, who died in 1037, and the more purely Aristotelian Averroes, known as Ibn Rushd in Arabic, who died in 1198, agree with the Kalam tradition that an infinite regress of causes was not possible. However, they see no objection to an infinite regress of effects and events, that is, a world extending infinitely into the past, because those past events is in fact no longer exist. Only an actual infinite, a bodily existent of infinite size is impossible, but not an infinite number of past events that has passed out of existence. So they deny the actual infinite, a bodily existent of infinite size, to be impossible, but not an infinite number of past events that has passed out of existence. Al Ghazali counters that an infinite past would still entail the accumulation of an infinite number of immortal souls that all exist together in the present. Therefore, an actual infinite being impossible, the world must have had a beginning. With such argumentation, the Kalam tradition is able to hold on to the doctrine of the origination of the world. However, Averroes, Ibn Rushd, as well as later Kalam theologians themselves, reject the proof for the temporal origination of the world from accidents. The fact that temporally originated accidents subsist in an atom or a body does not necessitate that the atom or body be temporally originated as well. The philosophers Avicenna and Averroes, Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd. Philosophers like Avicenna and Averroes encounter the same problems as the Kalam theologians relating time and God. Both need to bridge between a God who is timelessly eternal and a world of temporality. Avicenna, in his Neoplatonism, addresses this with a theory of eternal emanation. God is the first or the one who is necessarily existent in itself and pure, unchanging, and timeless simplicity. The first is also perfect generosity, And out of this generosity emanates the first intellect in timeless eternity. The first does not precede the first intellect in time, but in essence. To prove the simplicity, to preserve the simplicity of the one from plurality, only one thing, the first intellect emanates from the one. Avicenna then introduced plurality into the contingent world through a sequence of eternal intellects and souls extending from the first intellect downward to the tenth intellect, or active intellect, and the sphere of the moon. The active intellect then generates the forms and matter of the temporal, sublunary world of generation and corruption. The intermediary chain of eternal intellects and souls mediate between the upper simplicity of the unchanging eternal one and the temporal plurality of the region below the moon. As already noted, Avicenna rejects the Kalam notion that God originated the world temporally. If the world had a beginning, he argues, some prior cause would have had to emerge to prompt God to begin creating. A beginning to creation would have required God to change from not creating to creating, which would have entailed imperfection in God before God began creating. Despite this, Avicenna can still speak of God's willing and choosing to create the world. However, God wills and chooses only in the sense that God knows what emanates from him. God does not choose among options, and God's choice does not proceed from the potential to the actual. God is pure actuality, and emanation is accidental. Emanation is not essential to God's essence, but it is nonetheless a necessary concomitant of God's essence. In fact, God, in his perfection, emanates the world in the best possible way. The first is the cause of the best possible order. Avicenna does not escape criticism. Al Ghazali, famous for attacking Avicenna's emanation metaphysics and for condemning adherence to the world's eternity as unbelief in his incoherence of the philosophers, Tuhafat al Falasifa. Al Ghazali himself bridges between the eternal God and the temporal world by asserting that it is the very nature of God's eternal will to choose when the world began, without any kind of real or temporal cause. In no way does the exercise of God's eternal will introduce change or temporality in God, nor does it compromise God's perfection. Indeed, a world that is eternal would have no cause, because for Al Ghazali, the eternal is by definition causeless. Averroes is well known for having written a refutation of Al Ghazali's incoherence of the philosophers. Ibn Rushd agrees with Al Ghazali in rejecting Avicenna's emanation scheme, but he opposes Al Ghazali by insisting that the perfection of God entails a process of continuous creation. The world in itself is not eternal. If the world were eternal in its essence, it would have no agent. Instead, God perpetually originates created things from pre existing matter, and God has been creating this matter from eternity. Averroes also provides an analysis of the debate between Kalam theology and Avicennan philosophy in his decisive treatise, Fasl al Maqal. According to Averroes, both sides agree that some things originate in time by virtue of an efficient cause. They also agree that there is an eternal existent that did not come into existence in time nor from something else. In other words, both sides agree on the existence of things in the world that are temporal and on the existence of a timelessly eternal God. They also agree that the world as a whole has a cause. They only The only thing they differ over is what to call the world. The philosophers call the world eternal, and the Kalam theologians called it temporally originated. Averroes goes on to observe that neither Avicennan philosophers nor Kalam theologians follow the plain sense, Zahir of the revealed texts. The Quran says that God is the one who created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and his throne was on the water. Quran chapter 11, verse 7. The plain sense of the text points to the existence of water and God's throne before the creation of this world in 6 days. Another Quranic text on God's creation of the heavens is similar. God rose over the heaven when it was smoke, and he said to it and to the earth, "Come willingly or unwillingly." They both said, "We come willingly." Chapter 41, verse 11. This verse indicates that God created the heavens from smoke that existed beforehand. For Ibn Rushd, these texts do not support the Kalam view of creation, they instead support Averroes' own view of continuous creation. Fakhr ad-Din al-Razi. The Ashari theologian Fakhr ad-Din al-Razi, who died in 1210, lived about the same time as Averroes, but the two were not aware of each other. Al-Razi lived in the Eastern Islamic world, mainly in what is today Iran and Afghanistan, while Averroes lived in Andalusia and North Africa. Al-Razi usually defends traditional Ashari positions, but his analysis of the debate over the origin of the world in his late work Sublime Issues, Al-Matalib al-Aliyah, bears some similarities to that of Ibn Rushd. Al-Razi carefully examines both scriptural and rational arguments for and against the eternity of the world. He concludes that the Quran does not support the arguments of either the philosophers or the Kalam theologians conclusively. The rational arguments for each side are likewise inconclusive. The only thing certain is that the world depends on God for its existence. Throughout the main part of his career, Ar-Razi affirms the Ashari view that God is timeless and not subject to temporal origination in his essence. However, again in his late work, Sublime Issues, he asserts that the Ashari, Mu'tazilis, and the philosophers cannot evade the logical conclusion that temporally originating events subsist in the essence of God. Ar-Razi argues, for example, that this follows from God's knowledge of particulars in the world. Change in the things that God knows entails change in God's knowledge, which implies temporality in God. Similarly, God's acts of intention and will to originate involve temporal origination in God's essence. Additionally, God's hearing of speech and seeing of a picture before the speech and picture exist would be impossible. So, God's hearing and seeing must involve temporal origination in God. Such arguments had been made earlier by the Karami religious movement to link God's creative activity to the temporality of the world and to oppose the timeless and static God of Maturidi Kalam theology. The Karamis emerged in the 9th century, thrived in present day Afghanistan and Iran, and died out in the 13th century. Also, the philosopher Abu Barakat al Baghdadi, who died in 1165, posited temporally originating willings in God's essence to will events in the world, alongside an eternal divine will to will eternal existence. However, neither the Karamis nor Ar-Razi and Abu Barakat al-Baghdadi appear to have worked through the implication of temporality in the essence of God as comprehensively as Ibn Taymiyya does. Ibn Taymiyya on continuous creation in the perfection of God. Ibn Taymiyya is best known in recent decades as the main medieval inspiration for radical jihadism. This reputation, however, is built on historical anachronism insofar as jihadis appropriate his views to the modern day ends by decontextualizing him. That aside, Ibn Taymiyyah wrote more on theology than any other subject. His main competitor was Ashari Kalam theology, especially the thoughts of Fakhruddin al-Razi. He also wrote a long refutation of the 12-ver Shi'i theologian Alama al-Hilli, who died in 1325, who adopted largely Mu'tazili views that contain some of his most sophisticated discussion of God's creation of the world. Additionally, Ibn Taymiyyah interacted with the philosophies of both Avicenna and Averroes. Al-Razi has concluded in his Sublime Issues that both scriptural and rational arguments for and against the eternity of the world were inconclusive. Ibn Taymiyyah is unsympathetic to Ar-Razi's analysis. He responds that Ar-Razi got confused between the two major positions because he was not aware of the correct view on creation in the middle, the view supported by both revelation and reason. Rather than leave the issue unresolved, Ibn Taymiyyah seeks to reason out a mediating position. Ibn Taymiyyah agrees with Al-Ghazali and the Kalam theologians that eternal objects do not have an agent, cause, and that created objects come into existence after not having existed. If the world were eternal, it would have no creator. Only God is eternal and unoriginated. This led Ibn Taymiyyah to reject Avicenna's scheme of eternal emanation. There is no chain of eternal intellects and souls emanating down from God to the region of generation and decay below the moon. Everything other than God comes into existence after it did not exist. Yet, Ibn Taymiyyah affirms with the philosophers that the perfection of God necessarily entails that God create from eternity to eternity. Against Al Ghazali and the Kalam tradition, God could not have started creating at some arbitrary point in the past without some prior cause emerging to precipitate the change. As Ibn Taymiyyah puts it is impossible that what is impossible, as far as God is concerned, should become possible without a cause originating. The Kalam theologians make God out to be doing nothing at all prior to creation, and then suddenly God starts creating for no reason. Ibn Taymiyyah also claims that the Kalam view of God, changing from not creating to creating, introduces imperfection into God. A perfect God will always be creating, as indicated by the Quranic verse. Chapter 16, verse 17. Is he who creates like one who does not create? Otherwise, God would be like one who does not create. To thread the needle between the Kalam theologians and the philosophers' views on God's origination of the world, Ibn Taymiyyah distinguished between God's continuous creativity on the one hand and the concrete created things that come into existence after not existing on the other. God in his perfection has always been creating one thing or another from eternity. God's creativity is perpetual da'im. Yet no one thing that God creates is eternal. Everything comes into existence after not existing. Each created thing has a beginning in time. Putting it differently, as Ibn Taymiyyah himself does, the genus or species of creating things is eternal, while no individual created thing is eternal. There has always been one world or another, but no one part of the world is eternal. There is no existent thing eternal alongside God. God is the only eternal existent. Ibn Taymiyyah expresses this as follows: as God is creator of everything, everything other than him is created and preceded by non existence. So with him there is nothing eternal by virtue of his eternity. When it is said that he has been creating from eternity, its meaning is that he has been creating one created thing after another from eternity, just as he will be creating one created thing after another to eternity. That which we deny, that is eternity, we deny of originating events and moments, one after another. There is nothing in this except an ascription to him of perpetuity of acting, not an ascription of one among the things he has done being with him eternally in its concrete entity. Ibn Taymiyyah on God's continuous creation from eternity. Ibn Taymiyyah emphasizes that God's creative activity has no beginning and that there is no beginning to created things in the past. Eternity into the past or pre eternity, Al Azal, has no limit that reason could grasp. Any point in the past will always be preceded by the fullness of pre-eternity. Ibn Taymiyyah illustrates this point with the example of a large number of stees filled with tiny mustard seeds. Even if one posited the existence of stees many times the number of the steeds of the earth, each stee with as much mustard seeds as to fill it, and then supposed that with each passing of a million years, one grain of mustard seed disappeared, all the mustard seed would disappear and pre-eternity would not yet have ended. And if one supposed many, many times that it would still not have ended, there is no time that might be posited that is not such that pre-eternity was before it. Ibn Taymiyyah argues that his view of God's continuous or perpetual creativity is not only the most rational approach to the question, it also coheres best with the plain sense of revelation. The parallels with Averroes are striking. Ibn Taymiyyah was familiar with the theological writings of Averroes, but it is not yet clear whether he benefited from Averroes directly on this particular point. Yet, Ibn Taymiyyah cites the same key Quranic text that Ibn Rushd has quoted. God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and his throne was on the water. Quran chapter 11, verse 7. And God rose over the heavens when it was smoke, and he said to it and to the earth, come willingly or unwillingly. They both said, we come willingly. Quran chapter 41, verse 11. According to Ibn Taymiyyah, God created the heavens and the earth as we know them in 6 days, while God's throne was on the water. And God created this present world out of preceding matter and in preceding time. The Quran does not speak of God creating anything out of nothing. Ibn Taymiyyah clarifies that the 6 days of creation were of different length from that of our days determined by the rising and the setting of the sun. This is because those days were measured by the moments of the bodies existent before the creation of the heavens and the earth. Ibn Taymiyyah also supports his view of creation from the statements or hadiths of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam and even the Hebrew Bible. From the hadith of the Prophet, he quotes, God determined the determinations of created things 50,000 years before he created the heavens and the earth, and his throne was on the water. With regard to the Bible, Ibn Taymiyyah observes that Genesis 1, verse 1 to 2 speaks of water covering the earth and the wind blowing over the water at the beginning of the creation of the heavens and the earth. To make intellectual space for God's creation of the world from eternity, Ibn Taymiyyah must reject the two main Kalam proofs that the world had a beginning. The first Kalam proof states that an atom or a body in which temporarily originated or accident subsists is itself temporarily originated, which is called Hudusul Ajsam. Following Averroes and later Kalam theologians, Ibn Taymiyyah denies that this is the case. Something in which temporal origination takes place is not necessarily itself temporarily originated. With this, Ibn Taymiyyah opens the door to temporality within the essence of the eternal God. The second Kalam argument states that the world must have a beginning, because an infinite regress of temporarily originating events is impossible. Ibn Taymiyyah refutes two key Kalam claims against an infinite regress. Against the idea that an infinite magnitude cannot be increased, Ibn Taymiyyah explains that an infinite magnitude is by definition not subject to measurement or comparison with other magnitudes. He compares the notion of infinity to multiplicity. The numbers 10, 100, and 1000 are all multiples of 10, even though their values differ. In the same manner, one infinite magnitude may appear longer than another infinite magnitude from one's perspective, but both remain infinite magnitudes nonetheless. The second key objection against an infinite regress of events states that an infinite cannot be traversed. The Ashari Kalam theologian Al-Juwaini, who died in 1085, had said trying to traverse an infinite was like saying to someone, I will not give you a dirham unless I give you a dinar before it. And I will not give you a dinar unless I give you a dirham before it. Al-Juwaini explains that these conditions can never be met and no dirham or dinar will ever be exchanged. It will only work to say something like, I will not give you a dinar unless I give you a dirham after it. Ibn Taymiyyah agrees that Al-Juwaini's later statement makes sense, but he says that the former statement is irrelevant to an infinite regress because it is framed in the future tense. It would, however, be possible to say, I have not given you a dirham unless I have given you a dirham before it, in which case there would be no objection to an infinite regress of dirham exchange. Thus, for Ibn Taymiyyah, there is no argument against traversing an infinite number of events, regressing into the past. Ibn Taymiyyah on God's perpetual activity. Parallel to Ibn Taymiyyah's theology of perpetual creation from eternity is his vision of God's internal dynamism. Ibn Taymiyyah is firmly of the view that nothing can arise without a cause, and he applies this to the activity within God's essence as well. Here he departs from both Kalam theologians and philosophers like Avicenna and Averroes, all of whom maintains that God is timelessly eternal, and he elaborates the notion of temporarily originating events subsisting in the essence of God, introduced earlier by the Karamis and Ar-Razi in his sublime issues. Both the Ashari and the Mu'tazili Kalam theologians maintain that temporarily originating events, hawadis, cannot subsist in the essence of God. To support this, early Kalam theologians again resort to the idea that something in which temporally originating events subsist must itself be temporally originating. If temporal events subsist in God, God himself would be a temporally originated body. But God is neither a temporally originated nor a body. Later Kalam theologians are not as impressed with this argument, and they find other ways to defend God's timelessness. One argument is that temporally originating events in the essence of God entails an infinite regress, which is deemed impossible. So God's essence must be timelessly eternal. So the argument of the later theologians is that temporally originating events in the essence of God, entails an infinite regress, which is deemed impossible, so God's essence must be timelessly eternal. Beyond this, the Asharis and the Mu'tazilis diverge. The Mu'tazilis say that God's essential attributes of knowledge, power, will, and the like are just names for God's essence or moods of God's being. They have no subsistence in themselves. Otherwise, God would consist of more than one thing, and that would violate God's unity. For the same reason, God's attributes of action, like speaking and creating, does not subsist in God's essence. God's speech, for example, is created outside of God in the messenger who transmits it. This protects God from subjection to temporal origination. The Asharis in turn accuse the Mu'tazilis of stripping God of his attributes. God's attribute of speech, power, will, and the like must be substantives that subsist in God's essence. They must be real. However, the Asharis continue these attributes cannot be temporal because that would entail temporality and change in God. So God's essential attributes must be eternal. The Asharis enumerate seven essential and eternal attributes: knowledge, power, will, life, speech, sight, and hearing. These seven subsist in God's essence. However, God's acts do not subsist in God's essence, lest they subject God to temporality. To Ibn Taymiyya, these Ashari and Mu'tazili attempts to free God of temporally originating events are misguided. Ibn Taymiyya usually speaks of God's voluntary attributes and voluntary acts instead of temporally originated events, subsisting in God's essence. But he acknowledges these different terms to be functionally equivalent. By whatever name he denies that the subsistence of temporal events in the essence of God renders God temporally originated, it also does not introduce change into God, as change for God would mean acting out of character, which God does not do. Additionally, and similar to the Asharis, Ibn Taymiyyah accuses the Mu'tazilis of disjoining God's attributes from God's essence. To take the example of God's speech, a God who creates speech outside of himself in a messenger is not doing the speaking. The one in whom the speech subsists is the one speaking. The Mu'tazilis have thus effectively deprived God of his speech. Ibn Taymiyyah criticized the Asharis in turn for swearing the link between God's acts on the one hand and God's will and power on the other. For the Asharis, God's speech is eternal, and so there is no way that God's will and power, which are also both eternal, can cause acts of speech. By depriving God of causality in his will and power, the Asharis have also stripped God of his perfection. In appealing to God's perfection, Ibn Taymiyyah invokes a fundamental principle of his theological method. God is all the more worthy of perfections found in creatures than are the creatures themselves. In the case at hand, someone who can act voluntarily, that is by will and power, is more perfect than someone who cannot. Since God is all the more worthy of perfections found in humans that are humans themselves, it follows that God also acts by will and power. Likewise, a God who speaks by will and power is more perfect than a God who does not. Ibn Taymiyyah also insists that God does things in temporal sequence. It makes no sense to him for a timelessly eternal will to produce something in the world at a particular point in time. When God tells the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam to tell his people, perform deeds, God will see your deeds. Surah Tawbah, verse number 105. This means that God first issues the command to perform deeds. Then after that command, people perform those deeds. God sees those deeds after they are completed and not before. A God locked in timeless eternity could never interact with events in proper order. Again, Ibn Taymiyyah explained such a God would lack perfection. Conclusion. God in Ibn Taymiyyah's theology acts by means of his will and power with successive voluntary acts that subsist in his essence. As he puts it in one place, God has been active from eternity when he willed, with acts that subsist in his self by his power and his will one after another. He has been speaking from eternity by his will, and he has been acting from eternity by his will, one thing after another. With this, Ibn Taymiyyah turns the dominant hierarchy of perfections in medieval Islamic thought on its head. Timeless simplicity no longer stands at the top of the hierarchy, but temporality and voluntary action instead. Ibn Taymiyyah was not without precedents, such as the Karamis and the later Ar-Razi, but he appears to be the most thorough and consistent in working this position through. Ibn Taymiyya's theology of a perpetually dynamic and creative God found a very modest reception in the decades and centuries after him, mostly through its condemnation. The modern Salafi movement has done a great deal to revive the theological heritage of Ibn Taymiyyah, but it remains for further research to determine the extent to which Salafis embrace this feature of their master's theology. Nonetheless, it is certainly that the case that today's opponents of Ibn Taymiyyah still see need to condemn this aspect of his thinking. Ibn Taymiyyah's view of God's essential dynamism also finds parallels in the work of modern Christian theologians and philosophers of religion. In this volume, for example, Ryan Mullins argues for temporality in God's being, and Michael Schulz analyzes the character of God's temporality in the prominent Christian theologians Wolfnot Pannenberg and Hans Urs von Balthasar. Ibn Taymiyyah completely rejects the incarnational impulse that often informs Christian reflection on temporality in God. God for Ibn Taymiyyah does not enter the world in any kind of ontological sense. However, Ibn Taymiyyah shares with these Christian thinkers the desire to synchronize the temporal process of the created world with the eternal internal life of God and to envision an essential generativity in God that arises out of God's love and perfection.